Olympics, only 311 athletes participated. How many channels right now, let's say you're flipping through the channels and there are, what, 40 channels on a cable program. How many of those channels are devoted to athletics or sports of some kind? 4, 5, 6 whole channels just for sports? We've gone nuts on sports. Now, there's nothing wrong with sports necessarily, but the sports is a distraction. It's a tool to keep us distracted where we don't think about what's happening in our government. And it's working very well. Here's an advertisement for a 50-inch TV. It said, "Football is a religion. Build a nice church." And this is the attitude some folks have. Okay, number 6. Get control of all the media, like CNN, the Communist News Network, with Ted Turner and Hanoi Jane. And praise God, I understand she's been saved. That's great, okay? Thrilled for that. Ted needs it. Ted needs it also. But controlling the media, can you imagine if you were told 60 or 80 or 100 years ago, your job is to get control of all the newspapers in America? Well, how would you do that? Well, they decided what they could do. The communists had a meeting, or the one world-minded folks had a meeting and said, you know, they looked at all the newspapers in America. Everybody was independently owned. And they said, you know, there's 25 key papers. If we can gain control of these 25 papers, we can probably either put the others out of business or cause them to have to merge with us or gradually buy them out, you know, competition. Rockefeller hated competition. He said competition is a sin. That was his attitude toward it. Rockefeller with Standard Oil had, I think, a 90% monopoly of gasoline sales in America before the government made him break it up, broke up the monopolies. You studied that in history class. Rockefeller would go into a town, and if there were 10 gas stations, he would buy as many as he could. Hopefully, at least 6 or 7 or 8 of them. There was always a few, 2 or 3, that just refused. You know, this was my granddaddy's, you know, station, and we're not selling. I don't care what you offer us. We're not selling. Okay? So if gas at that time was selling for 20 cents a gallon, Rockefeller would tell all the stations in town, the ones that he owned in that town, I want you to sell it for 16 cents a gallon. Less than the cost of buying it. They'd say, boss, it costs us 17 cents to buy it. We sell it for 20. We make 3 cents. He'd say, sell it for 16 for the next 3 months. He would lose a lot of money for 3 months. What would happen to the other 3 stations? Go out of business. Now he owns every gas station in town. So guess what happens to the price? Up to 23 cents a gallon. You got to make the money back, you know, that we lost. I mean, that's the type of thing they did. And the government got involved, right or wrong, I don't know, but they did, and tried to break up some of these monopolies. Okay, David Rockefeller of the Rockefeller dynasty, Grandpa John D. Rockefeller was the one who started this. John D. Rockefeller, if you read the story about John D., it'll just blow your mind. The guy lived to be 90 years old, but 90-some years old. He absolutely ruthless man in many ways, particularly in business. But he started this Rockefeller dynasty by selling oil as medicine. Hey, take a spoonful of this crude oil, you know, drill it out of the ground. Drink a spoonful of oil will make you live longer, you know. Snake oil salesman, and developed a huge monopoly, a huge amount of money selling oil. That later led right into our modern medical movement. The AMA, the medical profession, is tied in strongly with the drug cartels, which is tied in strongly with the Rockefellers. And it all goes back to money. Anyway, let's read what he says here. Rockefeller is an international billionaire, a humanist, a CFR kingpin. That's the Council of Foreign Relations, okay, the kingpin. He's a founder of the Trilateral Commission, a world order godfather, and in all probability the high school graduate voted most likely to be hanged for treason. He voiced his praise of the controlled U.S. media for keeping their oath not to divulge the globalist plans to the public. Speaking to his fellow conspirators at a meeting in 1991 in Baden, Germany, one of the famous Bilderberger meetings. How many have ever heard of the Bilderbergers before? Okay. This is a group of folks, they meet once a year to lay plans for how can we gain more control of the world. Rockefeller said, "We are grateful to the Washington Post, the New York Times, Time Magazine, and other great publications whose directors have attended our meetings and respected their promises of discretion for almost 40 years. He went on to explain, would have been impossible for us to develop our plan for the world if we had been subjected to the lights of publicity during those years. But the world is now more sophisticated and prepared to march toward a world government. The supranatural means above national, supranational, sovereignty of an intellectual elite and world bankers is surely preferable to the national autodeterminism practiced in past centuries. What he says here is, we'd be better off with a world government with bankers, like himself, in charge, instead of every nation running their own people. His mentality was, we need a one world government. It's always been that way, and they work toward that very hard. And Rockefeller and their clan have been one of the primary people involved in aiding communism. They kept communism alive because you got to have an enemy to justify all this big arms race we got going on here. Pretty soon people get sick and tired of paying all this money for, you know, missiles and submarines and aircraft carriers when for what, you know? There's no enemy. Many wars could not have been fought if we hadn't gone off, if it weren't for going off the gold standard. During the Civil War, when they're on the gold standard, you got to have gold. You just can't buy ammo otherwise. Gold and silver. You got to have real money. Well, if all you got to do is crank up the printing press and print more paper money, well, that's simple to do. There's an awful lot of tragedy in the world. A lot of people died in wars that could not have been fought were it not for this love of money stuff we talked about earlier. Okay, here's what some of the news media anchors have said, like Richard Cohen, senior producer of CBS Political News. He said, we're going to impose our agenda on the coverage by dealing with the issues and subjects we choose to deal with. Let me stop right there. Anytime you see something in the news for quite a while that's really kind of stupid, like the O.J. Simpson thing, almost a year of all kinds of coverage on O.J. Simpson, anytime you see that, antennas ought to go up and you ought to think, okay, what are they trying to cover up? What they were covering up in that case was Bill Clinton's trying to give China most favored nation status and trying to give a Los Angeles port to China. They were going to allow the communist Chinese to have some property in Los Angeles. Well, guess what they would do? They would bring in drugs by the boatload. So many folks that have whole ministries dealing with what's happening, you know, United Nations, and Chuck Baldwin does a great job on that. You heard me on his program the other day. He said he can give you lots more information on this. Okay, here's President of CBS News, Richard Salant, former president. He said, our job is to give people not what they want, but what we decide they ought to have. Manage the news for them, just like in the Soviet Union. The New York Times is deliberately pitched to the liberal, that's socialist, point of view. New York Times, certainly a liberal paper. News reporters are certainly liberal and left of center, Walter Cronkite said. He should know, he's one of them. Barbara Walters said, the news media in general are liberals, socialists. Number 7, rules for revolution, destroy people's faith in their leaders. Wasn't hard to do here for the last 10 years, was it? Joseph Stalin is this is attributed to him. I can't prove that he said this, but many people say that's right. Okay? He said, those who cast the votes decide nothing. Those who count the votes decide everything. A man spoke here in Pensacola at the Shoney's Inn out Highway 10, Interstate 10, you know, and by Shoney's restaurant. He spoke several years ago on voter fraud. I went out to hear him speak. He said that they had gone during the primary when Pat Buchanan was running to be presidential candidate. They suspected voter fraud because every place the votes were hand counted, Buchanan won. If the computer counted them, Bob Dole won. So he said that they went to some place where they have these voting machines. After the primary's over, Bob Dole won, you know, and then lost the presidential race. They went to this place and they got 10 ballots and marked them all. Pat Buchanan, Pat Buchanan, Pat Buchanan. Fed them into the machine. 6 of them registered for Bob Dole. Now, somebody who has no morals, like Bill Clinton, they're not above this. Figure out some way to get into the voting system and control it. And all the people think, well, I voted for the right guy. Yeah, but your vote didn't do anything.